There's a place where science, spirituality, and human potential come together in a really beautiful way. As a scientist, I recognize the mechanisms and the facts, but we are more than molecules and DNA, and we're more than viruses and vaccines. We are delicate, vulnerable, resilient, powerful, mysterious beings from an origin that is so uncertain at this point. We have theories, but we really don't even know where we came from. And what I believe this pandemic is inviting all of us ultimately to ask ourselves is, do we love ourselves enough to give our bodies what we need to do what our bodies are designed to do to ensure our survival, our viability? Do we love ourselves enough to honor ourselves?
Is this the reality check we might have needed to show that maybe we're all in this together, and maybe our connection itself as kind of one species is ultimately more important than we had realized?
I think it can be. I think it has the potential. The question is, will we allow it to serve us in this way?
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs, sharing our vulnerability, overcoming our fears, transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Gregg Braden, the New York Times bestselling author, researcher, educator, and lecturer. Right now, the world is gripped by the COVID-19 pandemic and global lockdown, with over 1 billion people confined to their home in order to stop spreading the deadly coronavirus. Economic recession is all but certain, and personal anxiety and panic is running very high. Gregg, you are known as a pioneer in bridging modern science, ancient wisdom, and human potential, who's been invited to speak in front of the United Nations, Fortune 500 companies, and the U.S. military. Your books include The God Code, The Divine Matrix, The New Human Story, and your most recent, The Science of Self-Empowerment. Gregg, it's great to see you and great to hear your voice. Welcome back to London Real, brother.
Hey, Brian, it's so good to be with you always. It's really good to be with you right now. My sense is our time is going to go by so quickly today because we're in such a unique situation we find ourselves in as a global family. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to share some insights, some science, and hopefully give some meaning to what we're all experiencing today.
I'm really looking forward to it. And, you've just got such the perfect background for this, a great combination of science, but also awareness. And I've been watching the things you've been putting out recently, and I just love it. A few things really got my attention. And you said that this is a test for humanity. And you also said we are made for times like these. And I just love the way you're looking at this with a science perspective, but also with hope. And it feels good to listen to you explain what's going on here, and that's why I'm excited you're here now.
Thank you for that, Brian. I'm a scientist. I want to be very clear with our viewers. I am not a biologist. I'm a degreed earth scientist. I'm a geologist, but I have a very strong background in the life sciences. A lot of people don't know that before I was a geologist, I was a marine biologist. Then went from marine biology to marine geology to terrestrial geology. So I have a strong background in molecular biology and genetics. And the reason I say that, Brian, is because it has helped me to stay abreast with the almost daily discoveries that are being revealed in the peer-reviewed scientific journals when it comes to this COVID-19. A lot of that is not making it into the mainstream because it is so very technical, and these are obscure tech journals, but they have direct bearing on what we're all experiencing. They simply, the scientists don't have a platform. They don't have a London Real and a Brian to invite them on to London Real. So So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. I am a realist and I am optimistic, Brian. And the reason I'm optimistic, I think we have good reason to be optimistic. You just mentioned my perspective. We literally, this isn't my theory, it's not my hypothesis, it's not a metaphor. We are literally made for times just like this. We are wired not to survive, but to thrive in change. We're wired to adapt. And you and I have talked about this in other programs, so I don't want to be redundant to too many of those other programs. But this peer-reviewed science tells us, Brian, that we are not the product of a random process of mutations in the past, as evolution, as the theory of evolution would suggest. I am, as a geologist, I've seen evolution in the fossil record. It's a fact. I support that theory. So I want to be very clear. I'm not denying that evolution exists. It breaks down. The theory breaks down when it comes to us. And the reason it breaks down is what gives me so much hope for our time right now, because we are the product of genetic mutations that occurred 200,000 years ago in a way that cannot be explained by nature alone, that gives us everything we need to not only adapt, but to thrive when we're faced, when life brings something to our doorstep like we find right now. So we are made for this. Our bodies are so smart, Brian. The intelligence of our bodies know precisely what to do. And this is what I want to say to our viewers right now, is that you are, I'm going to look you right in the camera, right in the eye, you are made for times like this. Your body knows what to do. Our job is to support the intelligence of our bodies by giving our bodies all the things that we know our bodies need, by honoring our bodies, by honoring the gift of our lives through all the things that we already know that now take on even a greater significance: nutrition, movement, exercise. Ideally, if we lived in an ideal world, we would get all of our nutrients from food. We all know our soil is so depleted that can't happen. So supplements are important. And one thing I want to say, Brian, as I follow the scientific papers, I'm also a member of AAAS, American Association of Advancement of Science, and the bulletin boards, the message boards where scientists can talk back and forth to one another informally. A lot of good information comes from those message boards. One of the things I've found is the scientific and the medical community in the past have not been very supportive of supplements. It's something that isn't part of, typically, there are exceptions, but typically it's not part of their model. So what they're saying is the supplements don't kill the virus, so why bother with the supplements? This is what they're saying back and forth to one another. And this is where I take a little exception to that, because what I know is it's true. The supplements aren't going to take care of the virus, but the supplements give us the strength, give our bodies the strength and our immune system what it needs so that we can survive the battle that plays out inside of our bodies as our bodies are fighting off an unknown contagion. We've never seen this COVID-19 before. So we can talk more about that a little bit more if we want, but the supplements, I think, are important.
But I think some of the great things you were pointing out before is that just explaining some of the basic science. I mean, this is actually not a living thing, right? And I think a lot of people have a strange relationship with it because they feel like it's this enemy that's going to live anywhere and wait to get us, right?
It is, Brian. You know, as a scientist, I've been fascinated by this, since I was a kid when I began studying biology. So there are a lot of questions and misperceptions about what germs are. This is a germ. Germs are protozoans, they're fungi, they are bacteria, and they're viruses. Those are four categories of the way that we see germs today. Of those, all three of those fit a biological definition of life. A virus does not even meet the biological definition of life. And this is what makes it so interesting. People say, well, if it's not alive, how can we kill it? And we can't kill it. You can't kill what is not alive. What we're doing is we're trying to deactivate it. It is, you can think of it as information. All a virus is genetic information, DNA, very simple DNA, and that's going to be important in a moment. Very simple DNA that is wrapped in a lipid, a protein shell that protects it. And as long as that shell is intact, that is when the DNA is viable. Simple things like washing our hands actually break down that outer shell so that the information in that virus is no longer viable. Some of the supplements that I've mentioned in some of the other programs are antiviral supplements. Mushrooms, for example. There are peer-reviewed studies of mushrooms, very specific kinds of mushrooms. Agarikon is an antiviral mushroom. Turkey tail, an antiviral mushroom. Some reishi. Reishi has some antiviral as well as antibacterial effects. And the reason they work is because this virus, it's a spherical virus that has protrusions on the outside. Some people are calling them spikes, but when I see them under the microscope, they look more like protrusions. They don't look like, sharp, pointy spikes. Those protrusions are looking for places on the exterior of our cells. Receptors is what they're called, where they can dock, just like a space shuttle docks to the space station, is what they're doing. So the viruses are looking for a place to dock, and the supplements, the antiviral supplements, such as the mushrooms and some of the traditional Chinese medicines, yin chow, for example, what they do is they blunt those protrusions or deactivate those proteins so that even though they may find a human cell, they cannot communicate with that cell. So they're meaningless to us. We're not infected by the virus. So this is, it is a very bizarre way of thinking that's something that we cannot even see with a naked eye. It's hard to see with a microscope, and it is something that's not even alive. It's just changed our planet forever.
Right. And the COVID-19 is something even more unique, right? When you look at this thing, it's very different than other things we've seen before. And like you said, our human bodies have never seen it before, whereas the flu virus, we've been dealing with that with proven for thousands of years.
Yeah, well, it is not the flu. And this was part of the mismessaging that was happening early on. People were thinking it was just a bad flu. It's not the flu. The influenza virus has been around. We know from archaeological remnants, it's been around over 2,000 years. So our bodies have had 2,000 years to know what to do and to develop antibodies to the many different variations of influenza. A mortality rate less than 1% in the human population now. This is a new virus. We've never seen it before. Our bodies, it's going to take some time, Brian. It will take a season for our bodies to learn what to do and how to develop the antibodies. We will develop, as a species, we will develop the antibodies. The problem is that, I'm just going to back off. If an individual, and I'm going to talk right to the camera, right to our viewers. Viewers, if you have a reasonably strong immune system, the chances of succumbing to this, of dying from this virus are very, very small. The problem is that many people are immune compromised and don't know it, Brian. This is where the issues are coming in. As a scientist, I'm fascinated by this. The CDC and the World Health Organization identify factors that all contribute to being immune compromised, and some people are surprised by those factors. So they list among those factors, smoking tobacco is a factor. Diabetes is a factor. Overweight, obesity is a factor, as well as other factors that we would suspect if you already have asthma, or if you already have a heart condition, if you have undergone chemotherapy or had cancer recently. The chemotherapy and radiation, we all know, compromises the immune system as well. So there are a lot of people that fall into those different categories that may not have thought about themselves as being immune compromised. And this is the vulnerable population that we really have to take care of and help them now as we go through what we're going through.
Yeah, I think I saw a quote from you that you said, if you haven't cared for your body or honored it in all the ways you should have, well, this here is the invitation to kick that all into high gear. Is that what you were referring to? Just the fact that it is going to go ahead, and like you said, people might not know that their immune system is low, but certain behaviors can lower it.
They're lifestyle factors. Yeah. We all know what I was referring to in that particular quote is what we've just said, is that we are literally designed to meet these kinds of challenges. Our body knows exactly what to do if our body is given what it needs to do that. So our body knows when that virus is in our body, there's an attack from our white blood cells that will identify it, they will attack it, we'll start creating antibodies. In the process of doing that, our body will create a fever to raise our core temperature to make us inhospitable to a foreign virus. So that's what the fever is doing. This virus attacks the receptors. Those little protrusions are specific for receptors on the cells in the lung, in the human lung, and particularly in the lower lungs. So this is a little bit different than the upper bronchial kinds of infections. It's deep in the lungs. So our job is to give our bodies what it needs to keep us strong so that we can sustain ourselves in that battle that we ultimately are successful in if our body is given what it needs. So this is for us personally. Now, the scientists are trying to develop chemicals that will do this for us, pharmaceuticals, and they're coming at it from two different directions. One is prophylactically. They're trying to develop a vaccine to prevent people from contracting the virus. And what that vaccine does is it prepares our body, it introduces very small amounts of the virus that are diluted to a degree that we don't get sick. That's the thinking behind why a vaccination works the way it works. So that our body can begin developing defenses. So they're developing those on one hand. The other hand, they're developing medications for those people that are already infected. And these medications, times of crisis push technology, Brian. It happens during war and it happens during pandemics. And so our science now is being pushed to develop medications that deal directly at the level of the DNA. We've never done this before, where the medication actually intercepts the DNA of the virus and makes it less viable in the human body. So there are two different ways that we're going about doing this. Our body is also fighting what is happening out there, developing what ultimately will become what's called a herd immunity. So whether that herd immunity comes from our natural defenses or it comes from, a year from now, when some of these medications are available, or it's a combination of those. At some point, we will have that immunity, but because this is new, it's taking some time. I want to talk about that time a little bit. I did a little research. I have a chart. This was a very fast, quickly prepared interview. We didn't prepare for this, so I'm just going to hold it up to the camera. And I think people can, even if you can't read it, you can see the patterns that are here. What this is a chart of is the pattern, the cycles of epidemics over the 12 months of a year for different kinds of viral and bacterial infections. And while you can't read the fine print, what you can see from this is there does seem to be a pattern. And where you see the large and the darker circles is where the cases seem to peak. And you can see there is a pattern in here. This is an exception. This is hepatitis. It has a little bit different pattern. But if you look at here and you look at here, this is mumps, measles, influenza, things like that. What you see is they tend to peak. There's a March, April, May. It's right in the middle of the year that you're seeing right here, March, April, and May. And that is when this peak is. And then typically when we have an epidemic, they begin to taper off then June, July, and August. So you can see that happening. So the question is, does this COVID-19 virus fit that pattern? We're about to find out. We don't know the answer to that because it's new, but it gives us, I think, reason to suspect that this virus would follow the patterns of those other epidemics. I just want to be very, very clear. The first one was smallpox. The second one was rubella. The third one was mumps. The bottom was pertussis, which is actually a bacterial infection. It's not viral, but it still follows the pattern. These are all epidemics that we've seen historically in the 20th century plotted onto this graph, and you can see that they do follow that pattern. Hepatitis A, there's some other factors in here, and it doesn't fit that. I don't want to go into that now, but I just want people to see we may actually be moving through and toward the end of a season that will help in the mitigation of the virus that we're seeing right now.
And Gregg, they're talking about vaccines being super accelerated. I think there's 20 teams around the world on them right now, and they're saying it could be ready as quick as 12 months, which I think would be a historic record. You know, first of all, do you believe that could be true? And do you believe that is our solution to this? Or is it a little bit more nuanced than that?
It's a very complex question, Brian, and it goes back to the very essence of the theory of vaccines. So I know you've had on this program a dear friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Bruce Lipton, who speaks very eloquently of this. And I can't do better than what he has said. And what he describes very clearly that you don't often hear in the literature is that we have a system that teaches our bodies. We have an information gathering system in the tonsils. We have 6 sets, or we have 6 tonsils, three sets of tonsils. And that's why when we're young, as babies, you know, we're always putting things into our mouths. Babies are always eating dirt. They're, you know, everything, they're putting it in their mouth. By doing that, they're introducing the bacteria and the viruses of the world to their bodies so that their body can program the defenses that will follow them throughout their lives. So this is the nature's education center for the body. When we have vaccines, the idea of a vaccine is definitely a proven technology, but there are different kinds of vaccines. There are some that are injected into the body and some that are taken orally. When we inject the vaccine, we're bypassing that information system in the body, and our body suddenly sees something inside of us that it doesn't recognize because it was bypassed from the information system. There's a lot of question as to whether or not that is the optimal way to receive the vaccination. As you mentioned, this accelerated time frame for the vaccines is also accelerating the delivery methods, and there are oral vaccines for COVID-19 that are being investigated and developed right now, companies that are choosing to go through an oral platform. And if they were going to introduce something to the population of the 2 methods, I think that would be the preferable method. But having said that, I want to be really clear on this. Most people don't need that because our bodies have everything that we need to defend ourselves from the virus. It's those that are vulnerable. And what the statistics are showing is there's a direct correlation between age and morbidity. Historically, the older we are, the more vulnerable we become historically. And I'm going to emphasize this because the thinking has been that as people age, they have more underlying illness, more underlying disease, number one. And as people age, their immune system becomes weaker and weaker. Now, statistically, that may be true if you take the statistics of a broad general population. I'm talking to your audience, who I believe is an exceptional audience and are aware of nutrition, aware of how to care for their bodies. And I think there's a good probability that there is a portion of our population that doesn't fit those statistics. Just because they're in their 50s or 60s or 70s, they can still have very robust immune response. And because they've cared for themselves, they don't have those underlying factors through choices in lifestyle. So this is where we all owe it to ourselves to do due diligence. Audience, you know yourself better than anyone else. You know if you've cared for your body over the years. If you haven't, this is an invitation. Got some time now because we're on a lockdown. This is an invitation maybe to be a little more aware of the nutrition. What is it you're putting into your body? Is it the best that you have? Is it live food or is it processed food? Movement is medicine. The opportunity to do some kind of movement every day, whether it's indoors, yoga, floor exercises, outdoors, walking, running, whatever it is. All of these things contribute to a strong and healthy immune response. So you're right, Brian, they are fast tracking the vaccines as well as the medications. And they're doing it from a number of different perspectives in terms of how these things are going to work. But my belief, my personal belief, is that if we honor our bodies, we don't need those external support systems And I'm happy that the science is there for people that do need them, and that have the awareness that those are needed to give them the support they need to go through what we're going through right now.
And right now, Greg, we're on this lockdown. So, most of the world, billion plus people, probably a couple billion at this point now with India doing it, this social distancing. So 2 meters away, stay at home. What do you see here? Obviously, we're trying to flatten the curve. How long does this need to last? And then if we do stop doing that, is there a chance of this virus coming back in waves? What do you see here?
Those are all good questions, Brian. And as I said, we don't know the answer to all of those. I've got some notes because I want to be very, very clear. You ask a couple of questions within that question. So first, the idea is, okay, there have always been 3 ways that we could deal with this virus. The first was to contain the virus. When the first cases became known, to contain and isolate those, and that has been successful in the past. The Ebola virus, for example, there was one case that was discovered in the state of Texas here in the United States. That man was put into a very special quarantine unit that had been designed for precisely those kinds of experiences. That virus never escaped that containment, and it never found its way into the general population, so that we know that containment can work. We missed that window. For a lot of reasons, we're past containment. We can't do that now. So now what we're trying to do is what's called mitigation. This wave of virus is rolling across the planet, and we know now that we're not going to stop that. The question is, can we mitigate, is the term that's being used. Can we regulate how it shows up? The concern has been that if it goes unchecked, that so many people in such a brief period of time will have the symptoms, and so many of those people are in the vulnerable demographic, the population that's most vulnerable, that the healthcare systems in Europe, in the UK, and the US will be overwhelmed because they're not set up for those numbers of people. Then we find ourselves in the position of not being able to help those who are critically in need, and that's when the mortality rate goes up. So by social isolation, the thinking is we're not going to stop it, but we're going to stop how quickly, rather than have that big, we've all seen this chart by now, the big steep curve that overwhelms the system, that we're going to spread that out over time. People are still going to get this. It's still going to be transmitted, but it's not going to be that big hump. That's what the isolation is all about. And when we end the isolation, whenever it is, this is the question: what happens next? In an ideal world, what would happen is that the isolation has been so complete that people have followed those recommendations to such a degree that the virus has burned itself out, and that we all go back to our lives. The reality is that not everyone is following those. And when this quarantine period is over, that virus is still going to be viable in some segments of our population. That is pretty much a given right now. So when we end the isolation, we will probably see an uptick again, but we aren't going to see that big curve, and the healthcare system can manage it. And hopefully enough people have developed an immunity, either a natural immunity, which is, they're thinking some people may actually have a natural immunity, or an immunity because they have had the virus and survived it. And by this time, some of these fast-track medications may help to create that. And then we're looking ultimately at what's called a herd immunity. So that's where things are right now.
Now, Greg, with the Spanish flu in 1918, it wasn't the first winter that was the problem. It was that second winter where it came back with a vengeance. I mean, is that almost all but certain to happen again in 9 months' time?
I don't think so, Brian, because of what we now know. We do have the historic records to look at, and we've seen what's happened in the past. We have the technology right now. I think one of the biggest problems is getting people to take it seriously. For a number of reasons, and young people, because the statistics are showing that the mortality rate for young people is minimal. For I believe at this point, no child under the age of 9 has died that did not already have an underlying immune compromise of some kind, maybe asthma, or childhood cancer or something like that. And where you're seeing the mortalities begin at the age right around 50s, but you're seeing them 60s and over the age of 70 and 80, they skyrocket. So a lot of young people don't take it seriously. This is spring break for universities here in the United States. And a lot of young people are still gathering. They have been until recently gathering on the beaches and having COVID-19 parties, coronavirus parties, because they haven't taken it seriously. And now the statistics are showing they are developing the virus. They're not dying, but they are susceptible to the virus as well. So I want to talk about this is a really interesting point, and I want to say this before we go much further, because I don't hear the media talking about this. I don't hear many people talking about this at all, Brian. We're talking about the virus, the logistics, the physical impact, mitigation, vaccines, medicines, all of that. What I don't see anyone talking about is what's happening to us emotionally. And what I've seen in my own community, and I've seen it in my physical community, and I've seen it in my digital community online, is there's a lot of anger, there is resentment, there's confusion, there is frustration, there is depression. And what I want to say to our viewing audience right now is that our entire planet, for the very first time, I don't think we've ever had this in recorded human history. For the first time, we are simultaneously going through a process of grief. We are all in grief, knowingly or unknowingly, consciously or subconsciously, and whether we acknowledge it or not. We are all in grief. And the question is, what are we grieving? And the answer to that surprises a lot of people. We are grieving the loss of a way of life. The way that we were living our lives 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, we've lost that. It's been taken from us. We're social beings, and we are no longer able to gather together the way that we have in the past. Conferences, social gatherings, meals in restaurants, athletic events, concerts, all of the movies, all of those kinds of things. And that loss to us is like any other loss. And in the process of grief, and I can't do a better job than Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did, talking about the grief cycle. So I'm going to hold this up. The grief cycle often we hear about in terms of death. When someone dies, the 5 stages of accepting that death. The death is a form of loss. We are experiencing another kind of loss, but the 5 stages still apply. So very quickly, those 5 stages, the first one is denial, the second one is anger, the third is depression, the fourth is bargaining, and the fifth is acceptance. The characteristics of denial is fear. So many people are in fear, shock, confusion, avoidance. The characteristics of the anger, anxiety, and we're having a lot of people saying they're dealing with anxiety issues, problems sleeping, frustration, they're irritable, depression, the characteristics of that, feeling overwhelmed, helpless, wanting to just run away. So we are, as a planet, we're dealing with this, and I think it's important to acknowledge this, Brian, so that we can move through. It gives a structure, first of all, by acknowledging these stages of grief. It gives us a structure within which to view what's happening to us right now. So it's not just like coming at us from all over for no apparent reason. There is a reason. We're in grief because we've lost a way of life. When we go through those stages, we can go through these stages relatively quickly if we acknowledge and embrace them, or we can drag them out by refusing to acknowledge what's happening. So the denial, the anger, the depression is pretty much, I think, where most people are, somewhere in there right now. We're trying to get to the bargaining and the acceptance. Some people are in the bargaining stage right now, where we're looking for meaning. We're reaching out to others. The acceptance is where we begin looking beyond what's happening now. We accept it, we embrace it, and we say, okay, what's next? Where do we go? And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that this is happening to us, number one. How can we deal with the problem unless we're honest with ourselves about the problem? So honestly, acknowledging that this is what's happening. We're going through these stages. And then there is a thinking. Okay, I'm beating around the bush in the interest of time, and I'm just going to use the terminology. There's something called normalcy bias in psychological terms. Normalcy bias is where we attempt to live life as normal as we always have in the presence of circumstances that are anything but normal. It's a coping mechanism. It's our way of dealing. It's a form of denial by saying, and I'm experiencing this now with people I work with. As you know, I travel the world. I do live events, and I have producers who are asking me to make commitments for events in the near future as if nothing has happened, believing that when the isolation is over, everything goes back to normal. We can't go back, Brian, to the world that we knew 3 or 4 weeks ago because that world no longer exists. Now, before we finish our conversation, I want us to go into a little bit more detail about that. We're entering into a new normal. And the question is, what does that new normal look like? The answer is, we don't know because we're determining it right now. The choices we make right now are determining the world that is emerging. So how we deal with those 5 stages, how healthy we can allow ourselves. This is the key. We're going to go through this. We want to go through it in a healthy way. And by embracing where we are and then doing what we need to do to get through those stages. Grief counseling is important. We all deal with grief in different ways. So the unresolved grief is what's hurting a lot of people. A lot of people have a mental idea, mental picture of the world that we had a month ago, and they're hanging on to that picture. And that is the frustration. That is the struggle. That's the suffering, because that world is not present right now. If we can let go of our idea of what should be in the past, the world that we've had that served us all, be present with what it is that we're dealing with now, and do what we need to get through this in a healthy way, that will inform the future. And I am optimistic about the future. I believe, more than think, I believe we're going to be better people. I believe we're going to have a better world because of what we've just gone through, because it has exposed the cracks in the foundation of society, the cracks in the foundation of our systems that we rely upon. What's sustainable, what's not, what works, what doesn't work. So that's the reason for my optimism. My realism comes from knowing where we are right now, and that we've got to acknowledge and embrace this in a healthy way. I just covered a lot of ground, Brian. I just want to ask.
That's great. That's great ground. I mean, and the thing about those 5 steps, as I understand them, is there's no way to shortcut them, right? I mean, these are natural human steps. So, but what you can do is understand them, be aware of them, and move through them quicker and with more ease and understanding.
Yeah, Brian, to the best of my understanding, and again, I'm not a psychologist. I've had to come to understand these in my own life for the grief that I've had, and the loss of parents and the loss of jobs and ways of life. So as soon as I saw this unfolding in the world, I immediately went to this model because I recognized that we have just lost something. We're all in grief over our loss. Like you, my understanding is that we cannot bypass the steps. However, we can really condense the time that it takes to go through the steps. It doesn't have to take weeks and months. It's our willingness to open ourselves to embrace the fact that we are in grief, number one, and that we have lost something. When I say it doesn't have to be big tears, alligator tears, sobbing. It simply is maybe even vocalizing, yes, I have lost something in my life. I've lost something, a way of life that I really enjoyed and appreciated, and I don't know what's going to happen next. And I think that's one of the hardest things, Brian, is acknowledging there are things that cannot be known right now, because we like to live in a world of certainty. And the reality is that we have an uncertain future because we're creating it now. It doesn't already exist. We're creating it based upon what we know. So as we go into, we can begin talking about this a little bit, the world that's emerging. It's going to be a very different world socially, economically. It's going to be a different world in terms of the way we go about our daily lives. When we talk about economy, a lot of people think economy means money. Economy can involve money. We can have money in economies. We certainly know that. But ultimately, economies are about people, not about money. They're about people and the way people share the vital resources that they need to sustain them every day in their lives: food, water, medicine, energy, those kinds of things. I have been with indigenous communities that have very viable economies where there is no money. And those economies are very successful. They support those communities and they work very well. I've seen this in southern Peru. I've seen it with the indigenous people in Bolivia and other places. So we're conditioned to think about economy in terms of money, and I think money will change, and I want to talk about that. But when it comes to economies, what I think one of the biggest changes I think we're going to see, Brian, is the world was moving towards globalized kinds of economies through globalization. And I think we're going to see a return to localized ways of living. Localized ways of living are more sustainable than a globalized way of living. So what I mean by that, localized economies, localized sources of food, localized sources of business and trade. And I think we already saw the foundations of this being developed through some very forward-thinking communities that are trying to be more self-sufficient. But I'm not saying, we all become survivalists. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is, I think we're going to find that we want to rely less on the things that are important to us every day from coming through a supply chain that begins on the other side of the planet and depends upon numerous modes of transportation and many forms of handling before it reaches us, because we're now seeing how vulnerable those are to us. So I think this is one of the things that we're going to see is very different. We're going to see more of a localized economy that develops. Our financial systems were already very unhealthy. And I think this is exposing, perhaps for the first time, to people that were not aware. But this pandemic is exposing the cracks that already exist in the global financial system. And those cracks now are wreaking havoc on people's lives in terms of their retirement, their savings, their 401ks, their children's educational funds, and the way that we have thought about savings in the past. I think we are going to see more of a breakdown in the financial system. I think we have to. There are parameters that I have watched for years, and I watch these parameters ebb and flow. And when these parameters reach very specific places, and can I be specific, Brian? Are you okay if I talk about this?
Yeah, please. This is important.
Yeah, there are parameters, and some of our viewers I know may not be familiar with some of the economic terms, so I'm going to keep it really basic. One of these is I just want to talk about the value of global companies in general, what is called the value of the market. What we're experiencing right now is the value of the market is greater than the value of the GDP for most nations. So in the United States stock market is greater, the companies are valued at more than our GDP. That is a dangerous territory to be in. And when that happens, we generally see a pretty significant drawdown in those market numbers that affects everybody's 401ks, everybody's retirement, and all of those things. There's something called the PE ratio, price to earnings ratio, for individual companies. And you can actually, you can go online and you can see an aggregate of all of these. And there are ways to track these, and it's a way to track how healthy our economies are. A healthy PE ratio, right around 16, is considered a pretty healthy PE ratio. Before we had this collapse, the market collapse that we've seen within the last couple of weeks, the PE ratio for the stock market was right around 33%. So it was just about double what it should be when we've seen that in the past.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.